How's it going, everybody? Happy Monday and welcome into the Still Curtain podcast. I'm Josh Yourish with you for another Monday edition of the show. There hasn't been a ton of news in the Steelers world. A notable signing that's a bit controversial on the defensive side of the football. We'll get into that certainly. We'll also break down some offseason storylines and then get into the defensive secondary from a long-term roster outlook point of view later on in the show. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The Still Curtain podcast. Like I said, it's a slow time for NFL news. So CBS Sports, as anyone does, as we do here at Fansided, you look for different angles to talk about the sport that you're supposed to cover in the most dead time coming out of OTAs. The Steelers are off this weekend before they start to head into minicamp. So CBS published an article with each team's most notable offseason departure. And they listed Kenny Pickett for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Most notable, maybe. He's a former first-round pick. He was a local Pitt guy, and he's going back to actually closer to his hometown in Philly when an offseason trade. He netted a little bit more than the Steelers had to give up to get Justin Fields. So it's notable. It's a notable move, as quarterback moves always are. But the biggest offseason departure from the Steelers, I'm not so sure about that because they were so easily able to upgrade at the position, bringing in not one, but two quarterbacks better than Kenny Pickett. Kenny Pickett, like it or not, he's just simply not an NFL quarterback. He has no pocket discipline. He has no arm strength to push the ball down the field or throw outside the numbers consistently enough. He has shaky accuracy at best. For him to truly succeed, he need to do it in kind of a Drew Brees fashion, somebody like that where you're incredibly accurate on the margins. And he's just not that type of player. And then to compound those problems, he constantly bails on clean pockets and he forces his team to play off schedule. And he's not best in that circumstance. That's how he succeeded at Pitt when he was a superior athlete as a 24-year-old senior against 18, 19, 20-year-old players. He was able to get out and scramble and make plays. In the NFL, that doesn't really work when you're not an elite processor, when you're not an overly accurate passer. That's where he needs to improve, and I just don't see that ever really happening for him in Philadelphia, even with the offseason storylines that people want to write of Kenny Pickett's impressing and Jalen Hurts was struggling down the stretch of last season. So there are still some believers that think Kenny Pickett is going to be the guy who could take over in Philly. Well, I'm here to tell you that's just not the case at all. And it's also not the case that Kenny Pickett is the biggest offseason loss for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But there aren't a ton of other candidates that are big losses that are really going to hurt this team. And that's a credit to Omar Khan and the way he's been able to build this roster in his 2 seasons since taking over for Kevin Colbert. So the bigger loss and the most obvious answer to this question is Deontay Johnson. He's a one-time 1,000-yard receiver. You think that's a huge splash. They're able to recoup Dante Jackson, an outside corner, who Carolina was frankly probably going to cut on his 1 year left on his deal, about $6 million against the cap. Carolina was probably going to cut him instead. The Steelers flipped Johnson for him in a trade that doesn't get you a ton of value back, but it also shows how the league's kind of valuing a player like Deontay Johnson, who's already on a second contract, going to be expecting to get paid again. So we'll look at Johnson's numbers, right? He's 29th in the NFL among wide receivers with at least 50 targets in yards per route run. He's 33rd in yards per reception, 26th in yards after the catch per reception. This was all last season. 14th in drop rate. So Deontay drops in no more. He only dropped 2 passes according to PFF last season. He's become a shorthanded guy. He's a very good one-on-one separator on the outside, a true X receiver who can win against press man. That's what he's best at, is getting off the line of scrimmage, and getting open quickly. That's a perfect fit for the Carolina Panthers, who are trying to bring Bryce Young along and trying to salvage the former number 1 overall pick who had a disastrous rookie season while CJ Stroud set the world on fire in Houston. So that's a great trade for them. But really, while Johnson's probably the biggest loss the Steelers suffered this offseason, it's not a huge loss because they bring in Arthur Smith, who's a very different type of offensive coordinator who wants to run the ball a ton. Not that they didn't under Matt Canada, but he runs the ball in more creative ways. And he really relies on his wide receivers to be a factor in the running game as blockers. And Johnson's not somebody who's going to do that. He's a bit of a mercurial player. He's not going to give you that blocking. And he's also not going to give you big time plays anymore. He's not a huge downfield threat. I mean, I told you he was 33rd in yards per reception last year, but that's just among the sample of players who got 50 targets, at least 50 targets. There are many other big play guys who are on smaller target shares on their team. And the Steelers have some, like a Calvin Austin who could step into that role and make bigger plays down the field. So they don't really need Johnson's skill set that much anymore. I mean, last year, even with the ball in his hands, he used to be this punt returner who could make everybody miss. He only forced 9 missed tackles last season. Johnson's just not a huge loss, even though he was probably their most consistent, reliable receiver and was theoretically a great fit with George Pickens, who is that field stretching big play threat on the other side, who wins at the catch point, who's physical and, oversized. You want to build a well-rounded receiver room. Those two seem like a good match as your outside guys. But Arthur Smith's offense doesn't typically play 3 receivers, right? They want to silo all their targets to one main receiver. In Tennessee, that was A.J. Brown. In Atlanta, a lot of times that was Drake London once he started to come along in his development. And even players like Kyle Pitts, a tight end that the fantasy community wants to explode, guys like that just miss out. So George Pickens is clearly the number 1. He's cheaper for sometimes not giving 100% effort. He actually is a willing blocker, and he fits in that role. So this loss, while it can hurt the team, it allows the offense to be more multiple because Arthur Smith wants to pass out of heavy sets and run looks with multiple tight ends and running backs in the field. And he wants to run more often out of some lighter sets with willing blockers at receiver. So a one-time 1,000-yard receiver, it's a loss that the Steelers can survive. The other candidate possibly who is a more impactful loss than Kenny Pickett, though not a huge one, Patrick Peterson, who's still a free agent. He led the defense with 1,162 snaps last year. He was the only player with over 1,000 snaps on defense. 115 of the snaps came in the box. 220 of those snaps came at free safety. 225 came in the slot and 599 at outside corner. So he's a very versatile defensive back, and he filled in a lot of these roles when they didn't have a true slot corner. There wasn't a real nickel there. And then as Minkah Fitzpatrick went down, okay, Patrick Peterson, you can move to safety a little bit since you're losing a step. But he just wasn't a reliable outside corner anymore. So that's a loss that you can stomach as well. That's a fine player to move on from, as was a Levi Wallace, as was Mason Cole, who's already been replaced with an upgrade, putting Zach Frazier in at center. There's just not a lot of losses that this team has suffered where they haven't immediately upgraded. Deontay Johnson is really the only one. And CBS did this exercise, right, to just take a look at what teams are losing, remind us where we are after free agency, after trades, after everything. And the reason for me to extrapolate this exercise out and to talk about it on a show like this is not to answer the question in a vacuum, right? Because it was pretty easy to answer. It's to compare the Steelers offseason to the rest of the AFC North, right? Because you want to see how this team measures up. how the retooling of this roster is going, the direction they're moving in under Omar Khan. So let's look at who CBS had as the most notable loss for the other teams in the division. For the Bengals, it was Joe Mixon. For the Browns, it was their O-line coach, Bill Callahan, which that may sound ridiculous, but that's a big deal, as he went to take the same role with the Tennessee Titans, joining his son, coaching on his son's staff, Brian. The Ravens, it was Patrick Queen, and the Steelers immediately pick him up. And the Steelers, it's Kenny Pickett. Now, Mixon isn't the same guy he was a few years ago. Running back's not a majorly valuable position. There's actually another player for the Bengals I would have put in that spot. Offensive line coach, it's kind of a nebulous thing and getting a little cute with the exercise, but I understand the point. That's all to say, from my perspective, the Steelers' loss of Kenny Pickett, or even if you want to sub in Deontay Johnson, not nearly as significant as losing Mixon or Patrick Queen or even the best O-line coach in football. Losing Kenny Pickett, they already upgraded. Let's take a look even further at the more expansive losses of these teams. We'll go to the Bengals. I started with them with Joe Mixon. They also lost DJ Reader, who's a very significant player for them. Their defensive line was not good last year. Their defense itself was not good last year. Bad teams were shredding Cincinnati late in the season, even when they were competitive on offense with Jake Browning after Joe Burrow went out for the year. The defense, Lou Anarumo's defense, was not up to snuff. They lose DJ Reader from the middle of that. They lose Jonah Williams on the offensive line, Mixon, and who knows really what's going to happen with T. Higgins. But those are more significant names than what the Steelers had to replace this offseason, especially if Cincinnati is at an impasse with Higgins and they have to move on from him in the middle of the year before training camp, or he sits out for some of training camp. That's more significant. The Browns, they lost Joe Flacco, and that sounds ridiculous in 2024 as being something significant. I think there was a lot of variance with his deep shots, right, last season. But he was the better quarterback than Deshaun Watson. And now they have to go back to Watson. They also lost Sione Takitaki, Harrison Bryant, Jordan Elliott. Not huge losses. For the Ravens, it's Kevin Zeitler, John Simpson, Gus Edwards, Geno Stone, significant. Led the team in interceptions, was a ball hawk for their secondary. Jadeveon Clowney, Odell Beckham Jr., who's washed up, and that's a non-factor. And they traded away Morgan Moses. So that's a couple of starters on the offensive line, a lot of depth there, a running back that they've constantly had to rely on, even though they've wanted to play other guys. And now they have Derrick Henry, so he'll be reliable. Geno Stone is the one that really jumps out. They replaced Jadeveon Clowney with Adisa Isaac. But the Steelers are in a good spot relative to the rest of this division. They're gaining on these teams as each offseason passes, and Omar Khan manages this team in intelligent ways, right? He's not over-investing in players who aren't stars. He's letting some guys walk. He's drafting incredibly well. And eventually, when you continue to just add talent to a football team without any significant departures that you can't replace, regardless of the strength of the quarterback position, regardless of your financial investment in the offense, eventually the roster talent that Omar Khan has assembled will elevate this franchise, will put them back into contender status, and hopefully for the Steelers' sake and for Mike Tomlin's sake and for Russell Wilson and Justin Fields' sake, that's soon. Hopefully that's this year, where the Steelers can get over the hump and actually win a playoff game, because this looked like a roster that maybe needed to tear down a couple years ago, and Khan has quickly flipped that, where if you can get the right quarterback in here, the Steelers could be a contender in the very near future. And that'll take us to the exercise of the day, talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers secondary and where that unit is, because that could be the thing holding them back from contention. That's the spot that Khan hasn't really invested. And so we're going to take a look at that right in a second. But first, I got to tell you about DraftKings. Hey, Steelers fans, DraftKings is offering a fantastic sign-up bonus for new users. New customers can place a $5 first bet on any sport to instantly claim $150 in bonus bets when you sign up with our code FSBETS. You will also receive one single game parlay reward every day. The best part is that you will get both rewards even if your first bet loses using our code FSBETS. Not only gets you these bonuses, but it also directly supports our podcast. So please make sure you use that code. If you've been considering signing up for DraftKings, make sure to use the code FSBETS to maximize your first bets. This offer is only available to new customers who are 21 plus and physically present in legal gambling states. Please remember to always gamble responsibly. Check out the episode description for full terms of the offer to see if you qualify. And now, as we go through the offseason, we're taking a look at this entire roster. Last week, we talked about the offensive line with Donnie Football. He was great breaking that down. It was fantastic. If you missed it, go back and watch that one. Go back and watch breaking down the skill players with Tommy Jagai, who will do his show this week on Wednesday with Shane Kubis. And you can even go back to the first episode where I broke down Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, this quarterback room in Pittsburgh. We're going through the whole roster. We're going through all of the positional groups with our offseason roster doctor, giving this roster a physical, seeing what Omar Khan has done to this thing and the direction that this team is trending. And in the secondary, the first thing we obviously have to talk about is the signing of Cam Sutton. It's a controversial signing. There's a lot of baggage that Sutton brings as he comes back to the Steelers after a pretty awful year in Detroit and then some pretty awful allegations of misdemeanor domestic battery. It was felony charges. Now it's misdemeanor charge. Frankly, don't want to get into that. The Steelers made the decision. I don't think that this is someone, based on the reports, that they should have brought back into the fold. They feel confident in his character after having him around for so long. They feel confident in Mike Tomlin's ability to manage players like this and manage the locker room. When you reintroduce somebody with that pending charge up in the air, they feel confident. I feel less so, but let's just talk about it from an on-field perspective. The Pittsburgh Steelers in the secondary, they lost Patrick Peterson and Levi Wallace. Thank God on both accounts, frankly. Peterson, a trooper, right? He lost a step. He was a good soldier. He played multiple positions. He was willing to try to move to safety. It's just gone. It's time has passed him by, and that's fine. Levi Wallace doesn't really have the same excuse. He played outside corner and was just frankly awful. So now you recoup Dante Jackson to play outside opposite Joey Porter Jr. You sign Cam Sutton and Anthony Averett to vet minimum contracts this offseason. And that leaves you at cornerback, at least. We'll talk about the safeties later. That's a different circumstance. But at cornerback, it leaves you with Joey Porter Jr., Dante Jackson, Cam Sutton, Corey Trice Jr., who's intriguing after missing all of last season. He was a 7th-round pick, knee injury in training camp, but he's a promising prospect for the Steelers. Anthony Averett, Beanie Bishop Jr., Darius Rush, Kalen Barnes, and Ryan Watts, this year's 6th-round pick out of Texas. Only Porter Jr., Trice Jr., Watts, and Beanie Bishop are under contract beyond this year. Watts and Bishop on lower term contracts. That's not a huge commitment for a late round pick and a UDFA. So clearly Peterson lost a step. He was targeted 62 times last year, allowed 33 receptions for 403 yards and 5 touchdowns, had 2 interceptions and 6 pass breakups, just couldn't hang on the outside anymore, and took some time to adjust to play safety, wasn't a strong enough tackler anymore. That's fine. They tried it. It was an experiment. It was a low risk option. And Omar Khan, to his credit, was willing to move on. That's what I like about his roster building philosophy. He invests in stars, clearly. Some of those investments happened under Kevin Colbert when he was a huge part of the salary cap maneuvering for this organization. He invests in stars, and then he takes low-risk gambles at other positions where they don't have stars. So this year, the low-risk gamble is Dante Jackson, flipping Deontay Johnson for him. Joey Porter Jr. and Jackson are the clear 1 and 2 outside guys. Last year, Jackson was the number 1 guy in Carolina. He was targeted 68 times, allowed 45 catches for 559 yards, 4 touchdowns with no picks and 6 pass breakups. Those are similar numbers to what I just read off for Peterson. This is not some massive upgrade. They like Jackson. They like the pedigree. Mike Tomlin talked about this being a player they were interested coming out of the draft years ago. And Tomlin likes to revisit those guys and see if he can get more out of them. He believes in his ability to coach. That's one of the best things about Tomlin, and something he talked about in the Pivot podcast that he did with Ryan Clark and those guys a couple years ago that was so illuminating. And if you haven't listened to it, listen to it, because you'll understand who this guy is as actually a coach. He loves to coach these guys. Sometimes that gets him a little bit over his skis in the secondary where he used to play, because he believes in his ability to coach these guys up. And sometimes you end up with a raw Artie Burns who just can't develop. Maybe that's going to be what we get with Jackson, but at least we have confidence in Joey Porter Jr. to be the number 1, right? He looked good last year. He hung with players like DeAndre Hopkins when he was matched up against him when the Steelers played Tennessee, right? He was able to battle against those players. His length, his strength allows him to do that. So you feel good about at least one part of the cornerback room. The rest of it, it's up in the air. And really, Porter Jr.'s numbers weren't amazing either. He allowed 27 catches on 57 targets, 404 yards, a touchdown, 1 pick, 5 pass breakups. It's not that dissimilar from where Peterson is, or from where Jackson was, but we expect a step, right? We expect him to, with another year under his belt, another year of tutelage under Mike Tomlin, where he showed flashes, unlike a player like Artie Burns. He's going to be a reliable outside corner, number 1. I believe that. The Steelers clearly believe that, because they didn't overinvest in this position in the offseason. They did do is say, okay, we got to bring Cam Sutton back in here because we don't have an answer in the slot. It'll be Sutton, Anthony Averett, Beanie Bishop Jr. kind of competing in that for that nickel corner spot. They'll move Deshaun Elliott down there some. Minka Fitzpatrick will play there some. But let's just look at Sutton. We'll get to it now. From an on-the-field perspective, his 1-year stop in Detroit after signing as a pretty high-priced free agent, he priced himself out of town. The Steelers could have tried to re-sign Sutton last year. They didn't. They let him walk. They signed Pat Pete instead. He priced himself out of town because he was very good. He was an excellent cornerback in 2022. Detroit signed him, put him as their number 1, put him on the outside, and he was awful. He was terrible. This is not the Cam Sutton that you, a Steelers fan, remember coming back. He is damaged goods at this point from 2 perspectives. He played the most defensive snaps of any Lion last year, over 1,200 snaps, just 48 of those in the slot. So they said, we're putting him on the outside. We think he can be a corner number 1 on the outside. They were wrong. He was used almost exclusively out there. He was clearly overused and overextended on the outside opposite Jerry Jacobs and Kendall Vilder, guys that aren't good corners, and Detroit needed to address that position. They did this offseason. Sutton allowed 77 catches on 113 targets for 1,173 yards and 8 touchdowns with just 1 interception and 7 pass breakups. When you're targeting Cameron Sutton last year, whoever's over there produces like a true bona fide wide receiver 1. 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. We would be thrilled. You're thrilled with that season from George Pickens. That's just throwing at Cam Sutton last year in Detroit. And yet that's not even his highest reception percentage allowed for a season. He allowed 68.6 0.1% of his targets to turn into receptions last year. In 2021, as a Steeler, that number was 68.9 on 74 targets, a significant sample size. He doesn't play the ball all that well. I think he was a good cover corner in Pittsburgh. I liked his versatility. I liked him in the slot a little bit more, especially as kind of their cover guy in the slot when they would have a Mollett or a Hilton attacking and blitzing from the slot position. Sutton's kind of a different story, but in Detroit, that was a bad story with a bad ending, and it's worrisome. But at least there's more upside than there was with Peterson and Wallace, with what's a young group, an improving group, at least from the Joey Porter Jr. perspective, and hopefully Corey Trice getting healthy perspective. So it's fine at corner. This team is fine at corner. Okay. Passable, maybe passable. Certainly below average. The investment has to come soon. The investment is clearly there at the safety position. And it's probably why Omar Khan feels like he can't overinvest in corner. Typically, you can kind of pick one of two ways to build a defense. You want to load up on the D-line or you load up in the secondary. If you load up in the secondary, you want to blitz a lot. If you load up in the D-line, you want to drop into coverage a lot and let your guys get there, like a TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith. That's the build the Steelers kind of have. And they have their guy over top who can solve. They have Mr. Fix-It in the back with Minkah Fitzpatrick. He signed through 2026, the next 3 seasons, for a 21, 22, and $24 million cap hits. That's through his age 31 season. Not many outs in that contract. You can pretty much expect Minkah to be here through 2026. He's the highest paid safety in the NFL and the 3rd highest paid defensive back, only behind 2 corners. So he is very highly paid for a position that the NFL doesn't typically value very much. Linebacker is more the running back of the defense, right? A traditional off-ball linebacker has become a dinosaur in the NFL. Safety's pretty close to it, though. The NFL doesn't invest in safeties unless they're elite players. And luckily for the Steelers, Minkah Fitzpatrick absolutely is. Last year, though, not an elite season from Minkah. He played 11 games. It was the lowest snap total of his career, the most snaps in the slot because he had to fill up and cover for that deficiency on their defense. That was his most slot snaps since joining the Steelers. 2nd most snaps in the box of his career, for less than 2022 when he played a full season. So the percentage certainly higher of snaps in the box. And his first season of his career with no interceptions. So it comes down to a question of, is Minkah starting to lose a step? Or was this a usage issue? Are we overextending this guy to cover up the other holes? Because as the linebackers got hurt, they had to bring Minkah down, use him as a tackler, use him as a linebacker essentially, and they did that with Keanu Neal some and KZ some. And there's no slot corner, so we can put Minkah there. He's certainly above average. That's what the problem was with the Miami Dolphins when they drafted Minkah and didn't feel like he was living up to his potential in his rookie season because they played him everywhere. He is a good slot corner. He is a good box safety. He's even a good enough passable outside corner. He's an elite free safety. The Steelers unlocked their defense in 2019 when they traded for him and just played him at free safety. And ever since then, we've had to move him around because the defense has deteriorated in these other spots. And you see, like, Minkah can cover that up. Yes, but you lose the dynamism of that ball hawk in the 3rd level of the defense who's going to take away a lot of these deep passes. Now, there's also a factor of more too high safety looks in the NFL. Teams aren't challenging downfield. You look at somebody like Patrick Mahomes, who was one of the highest average depth of target quarterbacks when he came into the career. It was all about deep shots to Tyreek Hill. The NFL changed and said, we're not going to let you beat us that way. Okay, now Mahomes is one of the lower ADOT quarterbacks, and that's happened for a lot of other guys. So the theory would stand that, hey, you want to move Minkah to where the action is, closer to the line of scrimmage. covering up some crossers and battling with some tight ends and slot wide receivers. But that's not where he's best. He's best as a free safety, and it feels like the Steelers need to get him back away from the line of scrimmage, where he can play as a ball hawk, where he can bait quarterbacks into making those mistakes, where he can force turnovers, because regardless of how good you are as a defense, and even with the NFL changing to be a little bit more favorable to the defense lately in the past couple of years, you still can't consistently stop the great offenses in the NFL, but you can turn them over. You can cause sacks. You can force negative plays, and that's how you can be effective as a defense. And the Steelers are kind of losing that element with Minkah, and it seems like a usage issue, not a performance issue, even though Minkah was banged up last year and maybe is starting to lose a quarter of a step, a half of a step. So I'm interested to see what that looks like this year, because they brought in Deshaun Elliott to be his running mate, to be that strong safety on a 2-year, about $6 million deal. The cap hits escalate from 2.25 this year to 3.75 next year. They could get out of it if it's a disaster. He's 27 years old. He's maybe the best run defending safety they've had next to Minkah. They like to play Terrell Edmonds in the box a lot, and he was kind of a de facto tweener linebacker. Keanu Neal was kind of that way last year, but Elliott was a very good run defending safety for Miami last season, and he can also play some of the slot. DeMonte KZ is mostly a true free safety. 647 of his 791 snaps came at deep safety last year. So that's just the vast majority. KZ is going to be one of the over the top guys, especially in dime package looks where they need 3 safeties. But Elliott's going to be closer to the line of scrimmage. And that allows Minkah to play a little bit deeper, to be that ball hawk again, and to affect the game in those ways he's best, which is an exciting thing for the Steelers secondary. But overall, there are some issues. You're heavily invested in an aging but elite safety. Okay, good. You have 2 players in the secondary you truly feel good about. You feel good about Minkah Fitzpatrick. You feel good about Joey Porter Jr., maybe even great about both players from a roster building perspective. There's not a lot else there, though. And you compound that by the fact that it took a huge investment to get and keep both those players. You had to trade a first-round pick. It was a while ago now. You had to trade a first-round pick for Minkah Fitzpatrick. It was a good deal. It was good value for that first-round pick. Saved that season, kept them afloat, and delivered you an elite first-team All-Pro type of defensive player. Then you had to pay him again. So you're heavily leveraged into this one player. Joey Porter Jr., you took him with the 32nd overall pick. First pick of the second round. Last draft. And it's a good return on that value. But you're heavily invested in him again, and everyone else you're just trying to fill in with stopgaps, 1-year contracts. There's nothing that's reliable in the secondary other than those 2 guys. So it forces you into positions where you're playing Minkah all over the defense, where you're dropping more guys into coverage, right? You're doing different looks where you want to drop TJ or Highsmith or somebody from the defensive line to try to help that secondary, which is okay. But this will be the 3rd straight offseason as we get through this year, and whatever happens, happens. But it'll be the 3rd straight offseason where they're going into it knowing cornerback specifically is a major need. And maybe with a lot of the other needs addressed, Khan can say, all right, I'll get my corner. Now I'll put the finishing touches on what's a good but slightly aging defense, and hopefully that's the year where the window lines up. But it's been a while since you felt good, decent, even okay about cornerback number 2 on this defense. And considering the amount of tries they've had to fix that, Levi Wallace, Patrick Peterson, other signings that haven't worked out, some draft picks that haven't worked out, unless a player like Corey Trice Jr. or Ryan Watts really hit, it's still a problem. And it could be the biggest weakness on this team. And ultimately, even despite shaky quarterback play that I do not believe in, the secondary could be the Steelers' fatal flaw. It could be a situation where if Cam Sutton looks like he did in Detroit, and he's who you're relying on to play nickel, and you don't get a huge leap out of Joey Porter Jr. in year 2, and Dante Jackson is just what he is. He's a slightly below average corner 2 in the NFL. That could be the difference between 12 wins and competing for the division title and another 9-win season where you're hoping to sneak into the playoffs and you get bludgeoned by a Buffalo, a Kansas City, a whoever in round 1. And that's a legitimate worry for the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's the weakest spot on the roster, and it could be the undoing in 2024. That's going to do it for the show. A short one, a solo pod this week, breaking down the secondary, and fun to talk a little bit of Kenny Pickett. I didn't get to get my parting shots in at Kenny when the Steelers traded him away. So nice to, get that off my chest about how much better off the Steelers are to move on from Kenny, to move on from Mason, to move on from that, and talk about the offseason departures, a couple of moves that happened before starting up this show. And then next week, obviously, we'll jump into the roster breakdown for the defensive line and the linebackers. We're going to do it all in one. We're going to break it down. Hopefully, if all goes well, we'll have a special treat for you. Also, talking about who the Steelers might choose as Bill Hillgrove's replacement, because really, if we're talking offseason departures, losing Bill Hillgrove as the radio broadcaster for the Pittsburgh Steelers, that could be the biggest one. And so next week, we'll hopefully be breaking that down with a very special guest. Thank you for joining me today. This has been the Steel Curtain Podcast. I'm Josh Yourish, and if you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and Pittsburgh Steelers football and would like to support the Steel Curtain Podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain Podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, everywhere that you can. We really appreciate your support. Have a good Monday, and go Steelers.